We have with us Neil Hong from the University of Edinburgh, from the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Center. He is the director of the Software Sustainability Institute and a research fellow there. Neil, is fantastic to have you with us. Neil is not only a champion of software development, but has been a good friend and a supporter of the Helmholtz Incubator, and is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the HIFIS, and we're very, very excited to hear his talk and his keynote to kick off this very nice conference titled Doing Science in the Digital Age. Neil, it's fantastic to have you with us. The stage is all yours. Have fun, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you so much to HIDA for inviting me here to talk to you. And it's my great pleasure to be able to share a little bit about my own personal journey in research and in data science to you all. So as Andreas has said, my name is Neil Chue. I'm director of the Software Sustainability Institute and a senior research fellow at EPCC, which is based at the University of Edinburgh. And I spent almost all of my life looking at different aspects of how the world works. So here's me as a very little child, along with one of my lab assistants there, Paddington the bear. And you can see that we're both a little bit worse for wear, as I started off on my first experiments in physics. Specifically here, this is after my experiments with gravity, where I found that gravity does indeed stay at a constant rate, and if I jump off of something once, I'll probably still fall. So I've always been interested in investigating how the world around me works. And this is carried on through my professional training, through my education, right up to the current day. I've always been interested in finding out what's happening and why it's happening. So when I was growing up as a child, I grew up dreaming of these white-coated geniuses. So this is Otto Stern, who with Walter Gerlach demonstrated in Frankfurt in 1922 that what we thought and knew about the way that atomic particles worked and moved and interacted was very different from what had come before. So they did an experiment that looked at the quantum properties, the spatial orientation of something called angular momentum. Nowadays, we just say that particles have spin and that they have discrete spin, so they can be oriented in specific ways. I've always been fascinated by this particular photo because it shows Otto Stern smoking a cigar in a laboratory, something that you probably would not be allowed to do today, but it turned out to be a very serendipitous thing for him. So he was an associate professor at the time that he was doing this experiment. And as an associate professor, his salary wasn't very large. And he ended up buying a lot of very cheap cigars, which had sulfur in them. And it turns out that the sulfur he was breathing out over the experiments that he was undertaking reacted with the silver plates that he was using to capture the atoms that were being put through a magnetic field. And it helped highlight them, it helped expose them, just like in a photographic plate. So the fact that he serendipitously had a bad cigar turned out to be the cause of one of the most important discoveries in nuclear and atomic physics at that time. So there's a certain amount of serendipity in research. And I thought I could continue and do something like that. So I started off doing experimental physics, but in reality, my ability at experimental physics, notwithstanding not wanting to smoke, was very, very different. I found myself unable to repeat experiments, unable to get them to work properly. And so I found I was just too clumsy to work in a lab. So that was my first setback on my road to becoming a scientist. Nevertheless, I was very interested in these things called computers, and I took my love for computers and put it to work. I studied a degree in computational physics, looking at the way that we simulate particles interacting in many different ways. I did things like simulating birds flying through the sky, the way that information propagates around networks, and the way that particles interact with the different types of detectors that you get at places like CERN at the Large Hadron Collider. However, I quickly found that there was something more I was looking for when I was being a scientist. I wanted to have a more direct connection with the end result of the work. I took a job in EPCC, where I still remain to this day, a couple of decades later, working in technology transfer. And so what that meant was trying to find solutions for things that were more practical and directly applied to different areas of industry. So I developed things like algorithms to measure the size of mushrooms as they were going down a conveyor belt, looking into understanding how we reduce waste. I started creating expert systems for fishing boat captains, because one of the big challenges we have is that it's very hard to know when to make decisions. When do you cut a very expensive net and lose it to the sea, or risk it snagging on something and losing your boat? And I measured the shape of the human heart. So there are many different ways of looking at the world, and all of them can be augmented, they can be improved, they can be analyzed by using computers. In this case, the traditional way of looking at heart volume pictures is to have a surgeon look at it and identify where the different pieces of the heart are, and then work out the volume from that. What if we could do something better? What if we could help surgeons make use of their valuable time by giving some, using some computer algorithms to look at the way that they are using their own eyes and their own brains and trying to mimic some of that. And so these are my first jobs in what would eventually become the field of AI and machine learning. However, as I kind of went on and progressed, I discovered that maybe where I was really skilled and where I had the experience was in helping people to work together. So this is an example of a project that I was working on in the mid-2000s, which was a big European project called NextGrid, and it looks like a bit of a mess. And what this is showing a diagram of all of the different components of a computer system, looking at how they interact to try and provide an infrastructure that can be used for doing different types of scientific experiments. You can see lots of little figures on either side which represent the different types of users. And in some sense, my job was to draw the lines between them, to understand how information flows between different systems to make it maximally usable. How do we ensure that the data we need is being sent in the right formats, at the right times, and no part of the system is being overloaded over the others? So I spent a lot of my working life understanding how we integrate data together. And that's probably no better shown than in a piece of software that we were writing called HIDA. So HIDA was an attempt, along with a number of other universities and with industry, including IBM and Oracle, the people who were producing the large SQL databases, to produce a virtual data warehouse. And so what's a virtual data warehouse? It's basically something that can allow you to run queries against many different data sources and different formats without physically bringing the data together. So the idea would be that you had data situated in different providers, perhaps in across a country or perhaps across the world, all with different policies, all with different security and authorization mechanisms, but it would allow you to run queries that could help bring that data together without physically having to transfer it over the network, or certainly to put it all into one big data warehouse. And why do we do things like this? One of the big reasons we tried to create the system was to look at problems in areas such as public health. So here's a very simple public health problem. Let's say that you have a number of different health centers, health providers that are tracking their patients, and they are able to identify things like the patient names, the patient addresses, how many visits they've made, or how many calls they've made, and in particular, what are the symptoms that they are demonstrating? What are they saying that they have, and what treatments have they been getting? And the reason why this is important is it might help us identify different outbreaks. If we have a lot of people who are all kind of reporting the same symptom, then it could be that something is causing a problem. So we want to be able to identify this as quickly as possible. Now, the problem is that in some countries, particularly ones which have private healthcare, such as the United States, what we have is we have different types of boundaries, different geographical boundaries, different funding boundaries, different provider boundaries. And in this project, which we were doing with the University of Pittsburgh and the Centers for Disease Control in the US, our challenge was to understand how we might bring together the data from different providers that perhaps were situated in different counties. So each county would have its own public health authority, but each individual health provider probably served the patients within a specific geographical distance from where they were sited. So things may go across different health boundaries. They might be split across different regions and different catchment areas. Now, the good thing is that these public health providers do share data on their patients, so we can get access to it. So our challenge was, how would we enable a more integrated view of all of this data to be found? So what we might have here is an example of two different public health providers. So conceptually here we can see a yellow circle and a green circle, and those circles represent the catchment areas. You can see that these two different public health providers may be in different regions, but they may serve patients who are in another region simply because it's closer or because that patient has chosen to use them. The things that they're sharing are things like patient identifiers and patient records, tracks of symptoms. But the challenges are that in many cases, those conceptual entities are named very differently. So in this example, the thing that's used to identify a patient might be named patient ID or ID, patient identifier, patient number. And these numbers may not necessarily be the same across all providers. They may not be a global, unique health identifier, which certainly makes things a lot easier. It's something that we've been implementing in Scotland, where I live, where now everyone has what's known as a community health identifier to help bring these records together. So what we can see here is perhaps data that shows an outbreak of a particular symptom. So here we have these as represented as red dots for one provider, and they look pretty spread out. So there's a little bit of clustering there perhaps, but you can't really see anything from just looking at the data from one provider. However, when we then look at another provider, we sort of see something similar. The cases are spread across a number of different areas, different regions. There is starting to look a bit like a cluster just at that boundary on the lower left of the circle. Of course, when you put the two together and you look at what's happening across providers, you can see that there definitely is some sort of outbreak there. There is a geographical clustering of the same kind of symptoms. And if you're able to do this, if you're able to integrate and mine this data, what you might yield is some sort of early warning of an infectious disease outbreak. But this isn't new. This is basically a recreation of the work that John Snow did in London 150 years ago to map the London cholera outbreak. What we can do with data is, in bringing it together, ask it problems that we might not be able to do if we are only looking at one aspect of the problem. And this is a really big challenge that we still have today, mostly because open data, data that's easy to integrate, still isn't something that has improved very much since the days of John Snow and the cholera outbreak. However, there are things we can do. So this work basically taught me three things. The first thing is that the power of data is when it's brought together. Without being able to combine all of these different data sources, you can't see the answers to the problems. You can't see the patterns, you can't see the trends. Second thing is that software can help solve some of these difficult data integration problems. What we need to be able to do is make it frictionless, to make it really easy to bring data together and manipulate it in the way that you want to try out the problem. So you want to be able to do this in different ways and do this as easily as possible. And the third thing is that despite being able to bring all the data together, it's often really hard to integrate it. And in particular, for the work that we were doing, we discovered that no one can spell diarrhea. So it's very hard to identify when the same symptoms are coming up, simply because we don't know if people are reporting the same symptoms. So what's this got to do with where we are in the current day? Well, the same things are still causing us problems. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have COVID going around the world in different variants, stopping us getting together physically. But we can maybe look at data even like this. So this is a really great example of a piece of work that was done by someone taking a slightly different look at things. So this is a tweet from Kate Petrova, who had noticed someone asking a question, wondering whether or not the bad reviews that they've been seeing for scented candles, so the ones that have a perfume on Amazon, might have something to do with the loss of smell, which was one of the big symptoms of COVID. And so, as someone, as a psychology researcher who had a great interest in data visualization, they thought, well, what can we do about it? We can look at the data. So they took a look at the data. They mined the data from Amazon and other review sites to see if there was some sort of correlation that might identify where a COVID outbreak was happening, and to see how far in advance, perhaps, things were starting to spread across the world. And so they did this, and you can see in the graph that's on the right-hand side that there is a significant difference where what we're seeing is on year, the reviews for the candles are getting worse. So what does that tell us? It either tells us that this might be a good indicator, advanced indicator of these sorts of rhinoviruses, or it might just be that the candle manufacturers are being bad at quality control. Who knows? But it's a really interesting idea that if you have public and open data, so data that you're able to do this kind of analysis on easily, if you have the tools to do this, you can start asking questions that might have very unexpected results. So that brings me back to my childhood and to this picture of Otto Stern. And one of the questions that I have to bring up, because this is a conference which is all about understanding how we work together, understanding how we can be good researchers in the modern digital age. And that's a question about whether the hero science the hero model of science is still appropriate. So if you don't know what the hero model of science is, it's the idea that what we have is a very strict hierarchy in science. We do our degrees, we get our postgraduate, our doctorates, we become research assistants in a lab named after a professor. We strive to become professors ourselves, to produce a program of research that we do in isolation from others. It is all about focus. It's all about competition. It's all about a model that was really based on the idea that people were funded through benefactors, and they were competing for money and competing for favors. It's a model which really benefits those who can shout the loudest, who have the strongest personalities, who are the best at the politics. And if we look at a model like this, the challenge is that we are neglecting all sorts of really useful skills and experience that are brought by people with different personalities with different lived experiences. And I think that's a bad thing. So I think the way that we should be looking at science is to be collaborative. And there's no better example of this than the Carpentries. So for those of you who don't know what the Carpentries is, the Carpentries is a worldwide initiative and movement to ensure that all researchers have access to the foundational software engineering and data science skills that they need to do modern research. It started off because a number of different scientists in different areas around the world realized that people weren't being taught these skills, and now it is a open worldwide collaborative movement that's taught workshops across all 7 continents. Today, there are so many workshops going on that use the Carpentries material that there is probably one going on this week. In fact, I know there's one going on this week because some of my colleagues are running one. And I think what's wonderful about the Carpentries is that it truly is a collaboration. So there are some people who help to administer it and make sure that people are given support, but anyone can join in. Anyone can write lessons, anyone can help teach, anyone can help maintain and organize and advocate for it. And so this is how I think science should look like now. This is the way forward, where we're all working together, bringing our different skills and abilities towards a common goal. And so maybe that's the key message of this keynote. This is not a competition. It may feel like one, particularly as you go on in your careers, where you are forced to compete with one another to get jobs, to get funding. But our aim is knowledge for society. We became scientists, I think. I certainly did, because we are curious about the world, and we want to advance the knowledge that we have around it to help society. The COVID pandemic has showed us what we can gain from collaboration. I've been part of many different great collaborations that have been out of necessity in the last 2 years, where what we've been doing is trying to get to a particular answer, to be able to model the spread of disease, to be able to identify ways of seeing how viruses mutate, to work out how we just communicate better in situations like this and exchange knowledge. So we cannot go back to this way of working in small groups where we are afraid of sharing information, afraid of sharing progress, and afraid of sharing software. So yes, you may be asking now, Neil, you're the director of the Software Sustainability Institute. What has software got to do with all of this? So I'm going to change track now, and I'm going to talk about the role of software in being able to do this collaborative, open model of science that I've just described. So software is a really good way of helping people access data. I've mentioned this in terms of just integrating data and bringing it all together, but software really does let others benefit. This is a great example. It is the work of a high school student in the US who used some open source software called Beast to do phylogenetic analysis, some openly available data sets, and they won their science fair, their state science fair, using tools that were available to them that probably would not have been available to a high school student only 20 years ago. So they worked with their teachers, all of whom had a little bit of knowledge about different areas, but together they were able to look at a problem and basically get to a point where they were able to publish something that could be published in the literature. It was something that was going beyond what had been known before. And that's a really great example. It shows that by making things available, by giving people training, by supporting them to ask the questions that they want to, you can do pretty much anything. And I think that's something that I often use in the way that I think about how we should be making our resources available, how we should be documenting our data sets, how we should be making our tools usable. And that is to think about how a high school student would use it and the sorts of questions that they are asking. So, if you go into a high school and talk to particularly the lower ages there, they might ask things like, how does the sun cause cancer? Or does having more dustbins, having more kind of places to put your rubbish in your city, does that help people feel happier? All of these are questions that have come up. All of these are questions which are being answered by research projects across the world. And open science really does need software. So there's been 2 reports in the last couple of years, one from the OECD and one from UNESCO, which both recognize the role of software in open science. And they're really talking about the way that we reuse and value data. So if data is the resource that we're trying to make best use out of, software is the thing that allows us to do that. It is the tool. It is the infrastructure that enables this. And without being able to do this in a community-driven way, we can't hope to progress science at the scales that we're now doing things. The amount of data that we have and the sheer complexity of the problems that we're doing make it impossible to do things without collaboration, without these infrastructures. So open science doesn't just kind of want software, it needs software. The big challenge for us is that a lot of that software isn't very good. And that's where the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years starts to come in. So this is an example of a piece of software. It may look like a spreadsheet, but Excel is probably the most commonly used database, simulation program, and all-round tool for a scientist today. The challenge is it's very easy to make mistakes in Excel. In this particular spreadsheet, which was by 2 economists called Reinhardt and Rogoff, there is a little bit of an error just in that bottom right corner where you can maybe just pick it out. You can see that the selection of cells there that they're averaging over to look at one particular statistical calculation hasn't been extended all the way down to cover the countries at the bottom. Why can this be a problem? So this particular spreadsheet was the spreadsheet that was used to provide some of the justification for a lot of the different austerity programs put in place by national governments, because it seemed to suggest that reducing public spending would have beneficial impacts on GDP. And this is a big challenge for us. As researchers, as scientists, we have to be able to ensure that our results and the way we present them are as good as they can be, so that we have checked them as much as we can, and that we are confident that when other people use them, that they will be able to build on them, that they will be able to go further than we have. And there are many other examples of this. So Jeffrey Chang is a good example of a scientist who had to retract a lot of their work because some of the software that they produced had errors in it. So here, the data is good, but the software is throwing everything off. Even in computer science, we have the same challenges, where in a lot of cases, what we find is that the software that's being used and to provide the results of papers cannot be accessed or cannot be rerun. And even in some of the top journals, such as Science, culture change is really hard. So 10 years ago, Science changed its editorial policies, asking that computer code should be provided. A little while later, analysis by Victoria Stodden and her group found that still there was a substantial proportion of people who were not making that code available. And if you want to really have a bit of a cry about where we are with science and why the hero model of science does not work, take a look at some of the comments on these slides. And the slides will be made available, and they're already on Figshare. And just look at the ways in which people have been forced to work because of competition, where they are afraid of giving their code to other people or see it as something where it's being stolen from them. So yes, research relies on software. This is work that we did as part of the Software Sustainability Institute. where we surveyed researchers across the UK to find out what the reliance on software is today. As you can imagine, lots of people use research software, but what we found striking was that 68% of the respondents said that their work would be impossible without software. So as a researcher now, you can't do the work you want to without specialist software. And at the time, and I think it's gone up a little bit since then, over half of them were developing their own software, but a lot of them had no formal software training. And that's something that the carpentries, HIDA, and many other places are now addressing, which is really great for producing a capable set of new researchers. So this is why we set up the Software Sustainability Institute. It's all about trying to cultivate better, more sustainable research software through lots of different ways and means, by running events, by running training, by helping to shape national and international policy, by basically providing the support that's required for researchers to allow them to do things better. And so just in the last few minutes, I'm going to just talk about one particular thing that you can do to help make your software better. So one of the challenges is that good coding takes a lot of practice, and it's pretty hard to understand what are the things that help. There are some things, though, that can make it easier, and the key is to apply them regularly, to do them one thing after the other, get used to doing it. And this is all because it will help save you time in the future. So with a number of people across the world, I have been working on something called the FAIR Principles for Research Software. These are based on the FAIR Principles for Data. So FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the question is basically, how might we apply the same sorts of principles that have worked well for data to software? And so what we've been doing is trying to interpret them into a simple set of things and guidelines that will help researchers improve the practice for the way that they work with software. And we've tried to kind of like go further and further down to boil it down to the essence. So using persistent identifiers and descriptive metadata, making software and metadata easily retrievable, using well-documented APIs, standards, and references, documenting, licensing your code, and following community good practice. But what I'd like to do is maybe just share what I think this means for you as researchers now. And I think it's basically just 6 things. So one is to use a code repository and version control. Version control is a really great thing as a selfish scientist and as a collaborative scientist. It allows you to ensure that you have backups. It allows you to share your things more easily. A license for your software, again, helps you understand how you control your software and how you want other people to work with your software. Documenting for your future self means writing the documentation that you need so that you can understand what you did 6 months later, maybe after you've had a little break, maybe after you've been working on something else. And I think the key to this is all of these different practices are good for you first, but also good for anyone you're working with. And that includes splitting your code into small parts to make it more modular, and reusing things like libraries whenever there's common functionality. Don't rewrite something that someone else has already written for you. But the last and most important one is possibly sharing your code with others. And what do I mean about that? I don't necessarily just mean straight away sharing it with the whole world. Sometimes it's about getting feedback. So sharing it with a colleague to help get some answers, ask them to use it. Give them some questions you have about it. Get them to give you some feedback, because that's the best way of finding bugs. You may want to publish it with your code and your data, depositing in a repository, because that helps make it easier to be citable. It gives it a persistent identifier. It allows you to gain more credit, and it allows you to find new collaborators. And those collaborators might contribute back. And that's something that you want to do as well. So if you use someone else's code, make sure you contribute. Send them bugs, send them issues. If you find a way of fixing them, send them the patch. maybe even just send them a little message saying that you've really found it useful to use their software and it's helped them with their research. I know when I was working on the Oxidai project with that virtual data warehouse, one of the best things was getting an email from another project, which I'd never heard of, saying, this is how we're using your software and thank you for producing it. Just don't expect anything directly in return. The great thing about these collaborative economies is that the best thing you can do is simply to contribute. And you shouldn't be expecting something directly in return, because the indirect benefit you have is much, much greater. So, in summary, I think that science is not a competition. I think it's a collaboration. And in particular, when you're working in areas which have got lots of data, you need to be able to collaborate, to be able to get all of the different skills in a team that will help you do the science that you're trying to do. So I think it's also about finding the collaborators who complement you. And that's why conferences like this are great. It's the networking that really is the important part. Finding the people that might become those who you work with for the next project, or maybe for the rest of your lives. Share your software, because it's a great way of helping you find collaborators. It's a great way of making your work more available and more recognizable to the rest of the world. And finally, be the researcher the world needs you to be right now, because I think the true heroes of science help each other. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave you with one thought, and that is, we talk a lot about data, and I think without data, it's difficult to validate results. But I think the real thing that we need to remember is that without code, we waste the opportunity to advance science. Thank you.
Okay, this is actually the worst part of the virtual format, because we would have some standing ovations in the auditorium now. Thank you so much, Neil, for this fantastic and truly inspiring talk. True heroes of science collaborate. I love this. And I was also very happy about the statement that the making software available and training people, you can do anything. That was very inspiring as well. So everyone, if you liked Neil's talk and questions arise, please feel free to use the chat, and we have Victoria with the first questions from there.
Yeah, exactly, Neil. We got a question from Gudrun, and she is asking you, thank you for the inspiring keynote. You were basically talking about the democratization of science. How can PhD postdocs contribute to this democratization process? What networks can one join other than the carpentries you mentioned? And from our steer committee from HIDA, Uwe Konrad already gave some inspiring links here, but we listened to your input here as well.
So I think that's a really good question, and it's great to see you wanting to engage with this model of science. I think it can start very local. There are different groups that you might come across in your local institutions. To start with, things like journal clubs are a really good way in, or things like postgraduate societies. So get to meet with people. Then you can kind of go on further. So some other networks that you might be interested in, there's a network called Reproducibility, which is run by postgrads across the world, which is all around reproducibility. There's a network called Pre-Review, which is where you can set up your own group that looks at different preprints in your area and gives feedback to researchers on those preprints. And it's a really good practice for both understanding how to read a paper, but also how to give feedback to other people and become perhaps a journal reviewer. And it helps engage at the point where research is still quite it's still quite malleable. So what you can do is, by reviewing preprints, it's much better than reviewing a paper, because at that point you've got an opportunity to talk to the scientists and help them improve their research. And then there are lots of other ways of getting involved. If you're more interested in the software side, there are plenty of ways of getting involved in open source movements. Google Summer of Code is a good way of more broadly being involved in open source. A lot of scientific software projects look at that. And there are other places. So I think one of the best ones I've seen recently has been run by Mozilla. So the Mozilla Open Leaders program is a great way of maybe establishing yourself as someone who wants to be a champion for this kind of way of working as well. So it's a really good question. I would say that the main thing though is just find something that's appropriate to what you would like to do and the amount of time that you want to give it. And if it's not there, there's probably information online from other groups about how to set it up yourself if you want to do a local group in your own area.
Genau, also die sind es.
All right, there's more questions coming up.
Yeah, exactly. We have a question from Kebede, and he's asking, how long can you store data in version control clouds, and how sustainable is version control? He says, I mean, what if GitHub, GitLab changes its business model or it's hacked someday? And then following, we have also a question from Uwe Konrad, and he's asking, we want to establish indicators to get better recognition of the software work in science, but it is hard. What is the status with respect to acknowledgement?
Yeah, so both very good questions. For the first one, that's a really good point to raise. So when we think about the practice, so this is both at the Software Sustainability Institute where I work and also with other people who've been collaborating on the Fair for Research Software Principles, we see it as being sort of two things that work well together. So one is using version control and using things like GitHub or GitLab. And then the other is about depositing things in repositories, digital repositories that preserve data and code. And those might be things, for instance, like Zenodo or Figshare or an institutional repository. And the key is to use them both together. So what you're using is you're using the version control repository for your kind of working sort of versions. So use GitLab, use GitHub, as you're working, and then every time that you have something which is more significant, more important, a version, for instance, that you've used to produce a paper, a version that you're sharing with someone else, then also deposit it in a digital repository which has a commitment to preservation. So you're right. One of the challenges is that GitHub is a commercial company, and it may choose to remove a repository because it's breached its terms and conditions. So you should always be using these two things in combination because they serve different purposes. One is really good for that working version, and one is really good for that version that you want to make available and share. And so one of the things that's really good is that now it's very easy to be able to transfer between the two because people have been developing integrations. So GitHub and Zenodo, for instance, work together to make it easy for you to transfer one to the other. And it really has become, once you've set it up, a one-button click to get a version across from one to the other. The other question about indicators to get better recognition of software. Yeah, so this is a really hard one. And I talked about the competition in science as well. And unfortunately this is the whole thing around credit for developing software. There are a lot of things that are changing right now, and it's been really interesting working on some of them. I've spent the last few years working with a number of others, specifically people like Dan Katz in NCSA in the US and Shelley Stahl from the American Geosciences Union, to look at how we, also Martin Fenner from DataCite, to look at how we give better credit for software and something called software citation. So there are a few things that have happened recently that are really significant for this. So the first is there's now a lot better support for software citation and making it easier for that credit to be identified and accrued and integrated. So GitHub has announced support for something called citation file format, which has been developed by one of my collaborators, Stefan Druskat, who is at DLR in Germany and also Humboldt University. And that allows you to very easily provide a recommended citation to people. So if you put this file in your code repository on GitHub, it now displays the recommended citation. But that still means that you need people to cite the software for it to come into the bibliometric systems. And that's where work with journals has been really significant. And we've been working over the last 3 years with most of the major publishers and a lot of the smaller publishers as well to do two things. One is to create policies that get cascaded down to journals about how software should be cited and what they should be looking for. And the other is to fix some of the metadata problems that we've had, which meant that software was lost in the publication process. And so there's a group called JATS for R, which stands for Journal Article Tagging Suite for Reuse. And they've just announced a recommendation that changes the metadata to make it capable of dealing with software better so that we don't lose any of this. So now what can you do? I think the big thing is make sure that you are providing what you would like to see as the citation for software alongside your software and its documentation in a citation file, format file, in the repository and so on. And the other thing is when you're using a paper or you're reviewing a paper and it doesn't recognize the software, so in the methodology section, it doesn't say what software it's using and give credit to it, then politely ask the authors or the journal what software was being used, what version was being used, how was it being used? Because I think only by asking for that to be surfaced in the methodology will we start seeing software being recognized in science.
Very, very important. We have some follow-up regarding that issues.
Yeah, exactly. We have another question from Emil. Emil is asking, have you noticed an increase in visibility and funding from the public hand for reproducible and open science, or has this not yet penetrated the mainstream public conscious?
I actually think it's I actually think it's penetrated the mainstream public conscious more than we might think, and this is potentially a problem for us because I think it's been one of the things that has been fueling the skepticism around and the distrust of science as well. So some people are using this this idea that scientists aren't confident about their results to push different agendas around climate change or around vaccine safety and so on. I would say it's definitely the reproducibility of results is something that is already in the mainstream. So we've seen it certainly in the what I would call the kind of quality mainstream. I've been interviewed for different places in the UK and national newspapers around this. And so it's something that I think is in the public consciousness. Have I seen there be an increase in the visibility for funding for reproducible and open science? I have, but I think it's been more at the policy level. So what I've seen is, and I've kind of shown that at UNESCO and OECD level, so at the very top, we see open science being almost mandated, and we're starting to see that trickle down to different funders. So we see it more and more in European funding from the European Commission. We see it within different national funders. I recently sat on a funding panel for the Netherlands research funder, who has now a specific open science fund that people can apply to, and that had hundreds of really high quality applications. In the UK as well, where I'm based, we're starting to see more and more work for reproducible and open science. I think we could do more. I think the difficulty is at present, what's happening is that most of these are in separate funds. And what I'd really like to see is that it's just a condition of all research funding that the papers, the data, the software is made as open as possible.
Glad to hear that you're optimistic. I mean, when we see all these black boxy ML tools being just downloaded and utilized without any knowledge what's inside them, Sometimes I get a little frightened, but it's glad to hear that there's a counter movement regarding that. May I ask a question? I mean, you made a really strong point about the numbers of scientists using software. I think it was 92%, you said, in 2014. That's probably higher by now, even though there's not much room to 100%, but only 71% received any kind of software training, as I recall your talk. Now, HIDA and its schools are in the business of combining cutting-edge data science and information sciences, obviously including software, with the challenges arising from the domains, right? And we do have the feeling that, like, say, in the classical education that you receive at the university on the domain side, like biology or geosciences or whatever, the curricula are not yet focused as much on these issues. So what HIDA would love to provide is filling these gaps, providing the people with very quick gains in this field. Do you have any recommendations for the crowd, and on the other side for us? What kind of let's say additional training should be pushed? What should the individual researcher focus on, and what should the schools, the grad programs focus on to provide for the crowd?
Yeah, so this is putting me on the spot a little bit, because as you know, this is one of the hardest challenges, is that we can have a sense of what the overall curriculum might be, and we understand the skills to become really good data scientists. But as many of you have seen, people have tried to map these out, and the problem is simply that there are too many skills required for one person to be trained in the amount of time. If we manage to train people in everything that's required to be a data scientist today, it would probably take them 3 or 4 generations and degrees. And obviously people are not able to do that. So I think the key thing may be to understand how we better develop specialists that work well together. So that instead of having one person doing 4 degrees, we have 4 people each doing a degree, but making sure that as part of each of those degrees, the working together as a team with the other 3 people is emphasized. So one thing I think that's really important, and it's something that was very new when I went through my degree, but is now relatively common now, is group work. So having those ability to do a substantial project or exercise that involves working with a group of diverse individuals with different skills and different education. So that's certainly something that I think HIDA is in a very good position to look at. And that might include, we see it in the UK increasingly, mixing things up between the different institutions and partners within a larger collaboration. What I think is a bit harder, sorry, Andreas.
No, I'm totally agreeing with you, making a strong case again, Neil Hong, ladies and gentlemen, for collaborating across borders. So I was really happy, excited that you make this point again.
Yeah.
Neil, I would love to continue discussing with you, but I have to look at the time. So
yes.
We want to do exactly what you are promoting here, what you champion of. We want to get people together now with this nice speed dating we have coming up. So we will get people to connect with somebody from very, very different fields and schools. But first, I would extend my sincerest gratitude for kicking off this conference so extremely nicely, and for your valuable support over the last years. And I'm pretty sure that everyone can check out Neil's bio and his website. You have all the informations at the reception button. There you can find Neil. And please do check out the Software Sustainability Institute and the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Center. Neil is glad to have you on board with this initiative.
Thank you so much. The conference goes well.
Thank you so much. That was Neil Hong. All my dear fellows and friends, we will definitely see him again at another point.